Everyone told me that leaving with $200 and a suitcase would destroy me. They were right, just not in the way they meant. I had $200, one suitcase, a one-way bus ticket to a city where nobody knew my face, my name, or the particular way my mother used to sigh when she looked at me. That long, drawn-out exhale through her nose that meant, there he goes again. I'd heard that sigh so many times by the age of 23 that I could predict it the way farmers predict rain, by watching the pressure change in the room before I even opened my mouth. Her name was Odea, my mother. Not a common name, even in our town. She'd chosen it herself. Her birth name had been something ordinary, something with 2 syllables and no edges. But somewhere in her late 20s, she'd decided to rename herself, the way people sometimes redecorate a room after a divorce. I always found it ironic. Here was a woman who had reinvented herself from scratch, who had chosen her own name out of a catalog of rare ones, and yet she spent 30 years trying to make sure her children never changed, never moved, never dared to want something she hadn't approved in advance. My father was Ruel. My sister, Calix. My brother, Soren, named after a philosopher my father had once admired during a brief, intense period in his early 30s when he'd read 3 existentialist books and thought that made him a thinker. He stopped reading after that, but the name stayed. And me? Idris. That was what they gave me. I used to think it was a noble name. By the time I left, I'd started to think of it as a brand, the way cattle get branded. This animal belongs to us. The morning I left, it was February. Not the romantic kind of February that appears in songs. Not cold in a way that makes your breath look like smoke and your cheeks flush pink and your lover pull you closer. It was the kind of February that just hurts. Gray sky sitting on gray pavement. The bus station smelled like burnt coffee and old upholstery, and something chemical I never identified. I had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a hard-shell suitcase I'd bought secondhand for $11. It had a small crack running along the bottom left corner that I'd sealed with duct tape. Inside, 3 pairs of jeans, 7 shirts, 2 books, a notebook, a charger, and a photograph I ended up throwing away in a gas station bathroom in the 3rd city I ever passed through. I did not cry at the bus station. I want to be precise about that because precision matters here. I've told this story before, fragments of it anyway, to people who asked, and the expectation is always that I cried, that there was a moment of cinematic doubt, a quivering lip, some final backward glance at the life I was abandoning. There wasn't. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of removing a shoe that's been too tight all day. Not joy, exactly. Not relief, exactly. Something between the two that doesn't have a name in English. What they told people afterward, what I only learned months later through a message from a cousin who still spoke to me, was that I had a breakdown, that I was unstable, that the pressure of life had cracked me like old porcelain, and I'd wandered off in a fugue state, probably toward something dangerous, possibly toward something shameful. Odea apparently cried at the kitchen table for an audience of neighbors and extended family and made it a story about her suffering. Ruel said nothing publicly, but told anyone who asked directly that I had always been difficult. Calix, my sister, 2 years younger, the one I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the one I'd stayed up with through 3 separate heartbreaks. Calix told her friends I'd had a mental collapse and probably wasn't coming back. Soren said nothing. That was the one that stayed with me longest. Soren, the philosopher's namesake, said absolutely nothing. Radio silence so complete it had its own texture. I want you to understand what kind of family this was, because it matters for what comes later. We were not poor. We were not rich. We were the particular American middle that believes it's one bad decision away from losing everything, and responds to that fear by controlling everything within reach. Ruel worked in procurement for a mid-sized logistics company. Odea managed accounts receivable for a dental group. They owned a 4-bedroom colonial with crown molding and a 2-car garage, and a yard that Ruel mowed every Saturday with a ferocity that suggested the lawn had personally offended him. On paper, we were stable. On paper, we were fine. But families are not their paperwork. What we actually were was 4 people orbiting a 5th thing, a set of unspoken rules so dense and so old that none of us could have articulated them if asked. The rules were things like, we do not discuss what happened in 2009, and you do not tell your father when you're struggling, because he interprets struggle as criticism, and Odea's feelings are the weather system that governs all other activities in this house. Plan accordingly. And do not want too loudly, because wanting loudly is the same as saying, this family isn't enough for you. And it was that last rule, that final, invisible, load-bearing rule, that I had broken, apparently, by existing the way I existed. I wanted things. Specific, inconvenient, embarrassing things. I wanted to build something. I didn't know what yet. I was 23 with $200 and a cracked suitcase, but I had this pressure inside my sternum that I now recognize as ambition, and that my family had always diagnosed as restlessness, which was their word for any desire that pointed away from them. The first city I stopped in was not the city I stayed in. I lasted 4 months in a room I rented from an elderly woman named Petra, who kept 3 cats and a collection of ceramic owls, and who charged me $380 a month and left me entirely alone, which was exactly what I needed. I worked at a fulfillment warehouse on the night shift, 12-hour days, 4 days a week. I spent the other 3 days reading, thinking, writing in the notebook I'd brought, and beginning to understand, slowly, the way you understand things that have always been true but that you've never had the silence to hear, what I actually wanted to do with my life. I want to stop here and tell you something that nobody who tells this kind of story usually tells you, because they're afraid it'll make the whole thing seem less romantic. The first year was mostly just hard. Not dramatically hard, not movie hard, where every obstacle has a clear shape and a clear resolution. It was the dull, grinding hard of being entirely responsible for yourself for the first time. Of eating badly because you're tired, and tired because you're eating badly. Of waking up at 4 a.m. and lying in the dark in a room that smells like someone else's life, and thinking, what if they were right? What if I am unstable? What if this is the fugue state? I did not go back. I moved twice more in the first 2 years. Each move was a recalibration. I was trying to find the specific combination of conditions, city, work, people, pace, that would let me build the thing I could feel but not yet see. In my second city, I started learning things online with a focus I'd never been able to apply in formal school, where the pace had always felt wrong, too slow in some places and too fast in others, like wearing someone else's prescription glasses. I started building small digital things, testing ideas, failing quickly and cheaply and without an audience, which is the only dignified way to fail. In my third city, I met Zephyrin. She was from a coastal town in a country I hadn't thought much about, and she had the particular quality of people who have also been through something, a quality I've never been able to describe adequately, except to say that it feels like a door that opens from the inside. She was building something too. We were, for about 14 months, 2 people building things in parallel, sometimes helping each other, sometimes just existing in the same space, which was its own form of help. When we eventually moved in different directions, she went back to her country, I stayed and kept building. There was sadness, but no rupture. Some things have clean endings, not many, but some. By year 3, I had something that worked, small, but working. By year 4, it was paying for my life. By year 5, it was paying for more than my life, and I had to learn, am still learning, how to hold that fact without either dismissing it or letting it become the whole story. I did not contact my family during any of this. That sounds colder than it was. It wasn't coldness. It was more like the decision you make when you've been running a fever and you finally break it and you know, in that first clear-headed moment, that the environment you were in was part of what made you sick. You don't go back to the contaminated room to prove you're healthy now. You stay in clean air and you get stronger, and you figure out who you are without the fever telling you what to think. 7 years. 7 years of clean air. I thought about them, of course. You think about the people you grew up with, the way you think about a place you used to live. Not constantly, but with a specific texture when it comes up. Calix teaching herself piano badly one summer, the wrong notes floating through the house. Soren and I watching films late at night when everyone else was asleep. Not talking, just watching, which was the closest we ever got to real communication. Odeya making soup from scratch on Sunday evenings, the smell of it filling every room, the 1 hour of the week when the house felt like it was breathing normally. Ruel and I once spending an entire Saturday afternoon fixing a stone wall in the backyard, neither of us saying much, but working together with an efficiency that felt, for those few hours, like love. I am not a person who believes families are either all good or all bad. Families are structures that do certain things well and certain things badly. Mine did some things well. It also did real damage. The kind that takes years to identify because it doesn't leave marks in obvious places. It leaves them in how you react to conflict, in how you handle success, in the particular tightness that appears in your chest when someone you care about looks disappointed. I don't tell this story to condemn them. I tell it because it happened, and because the ending is stranger than any of them planned. The week before I found out, before everything that came after, I was having an ordinary week. I was working. I was thinking about a new direction I wanted to take. I went on a run through a park near my building on a Tuesday morning, and there were these enormous old trees with roots that had buckled the pavement around them. And I remember thinking how long those roots must have been growing underground before they finally broke through the surface. And I remember thinking it was interesting that we call that damage. Then, on a Thursday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then another. Within 6 hours, I had 11 voicemails from 5 different numbers, and I had an alert on my phone showing me a sudden spike in a certain metric that I monitored. A spike that told me someone had found something, and that something had traveled fast. What had happened, what I pieced together over the following hours from the voicemails and from what I eventually found online, was this. Calix had Googled my name. I don't know why, after 7 years, she chose that particular Thursday. I don't know if something had made her think of me, or if it was random, one of those directionless searches you run when you're bored or restless or quietly wondering about a thing you've been quietly wondering about for a long time. But she'd searched, and what she found had not matched the story she'd been told. She had been told she had an unstable brother who had disappeared into something vague and probably sad. What she found instead was, well, it was a lot. More than I'll describe here, because the point isn't the specifics of what I'd built. The point is the gap. The gap between the story and the reality. That gap was apparently wide enough to cause a kind of emotional vertigo, because according to the first voicemail, which was Calix's, left at 4:23 p.m. on a Thursday, her voice doing something I'd never heard it do before, this shaking but controlled thing like a bridge vibrating in wind. She had immediately called Odeya, and Odeya had immediately called Ruel, and Ruel had called Soren, and within 2 hours, the whole architecture of the story they'd been living in for 7 years had developed a crack that let in a completely different kind of light. 43 voicemails in 24 hours. 43. I sat with my phone and listened to them in one unbroken session, like reading a book in one sitting. I made coffee, I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought with the first money I'd made from the first thing that worked, the one with the slight wobble on the left front leg that I'd always meant to fix and never had. I listened to all 43. They all said the same 2 words. I need you to understand. And this is the part that people always push back on when I tell them, because it sounds too neat, too arranged, as if I'm improving the story for effect. But I am not. Every single voicemail from Calix and from Odeya and from Ruel and from Soren and from the 2 cousins and from the aunt I hadn't spoken to since I was 16, Every single one of them, in their own voice and their own tone and their own particular frequency of guilt or wonder or something that was maybe both at once, ended with the same two words: come back. Not "we're sorry," not "we were wrong," not "can we talk" or "please call" or "I've been thinking about what happened." Just come back. As if the 7 years were a weather event that had now passed. As if the door was simply open again and I needed only to walk through it. I sat with that for a long time. The coffee got cold. The light in my apartment changed from morning to afternoon. That particular shift in angle that happens in late autumn when the sun comes through the west-facing window and turns everything a color that doesn't have a name. The wobble in the table leg was still there. I pressed my foot against it once, absently. Here is what I know about come back. It is not an apology. It is a summons. It contains within it the same architecture as everything that made me leave. The assumption that I exist in relation to them, that my correct position is near them, that the story is theirs and I am a character in it who has wandered off script. Come back is not the same as I see you. It is not the same as I was wrong about what you were. It is the same request, wearing new clothes. And here is also what I know. It moved me. Not toward the door, not toward a plane ticket or a phone call or any of the things they were asking for. But it moved me in the way that only true things move you. Things that are simultaneously painful and clarifying. Like pressing on a bruise to make sure it's real. I called Calix. Not that day. 3 days later, on a Sunday evening, after I'd given myself enough time to know what I wanted to say and what I didn't. She answered on the first ring. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I won't reconstruct it fully here because it belongs to her as much as to me, and some things should stay between the people who lived them. But I'll tell you this. At one point, about an hour in, she said, and her voice by then had lost the shaking quality and become something steadier, something that sounded more like the Calix I had taught to ride a bicycle. She said, I keep trying to figure out who told us that story about you, and I think we just told it to each other. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, yeah, I think that's right. We are not the family we were. We will not be. 7 years and the kind of honest conversation that 2 hours and 40 minutes of phone call can contain. None of that erases what the pattern was, or the real cost it had, or the work it took me to build a life outside of it. I don't believe in the version of this story where everyone sits down at a table and the understanding flows freely, and the soup smells like Sunday, and it's all resolved. But I talked to Soren last month. First real conversation we'd had since I was 23. We talked for 40 minutes. He's reading again. Not existentialism, something else now. Something about ecology and deep time and the way forests communicate underground through root systems. He told me about it with a kind of enthusiasm I hadn't heard from him since we were children. And I listened. And it occurred to me that maybe the roots don't break the pavement because they're violent. Maybe they break it because they've been growing for so long in the dark that eventually they simply run out of room to be invisible. I still have the suitcase. The duct tape on the bottom corner is gray now, aged. I keep it in a closet. I don't plan to throw it away. I came back with more than $200. I came back differently, on my terms. Slowly, partially, carefully. The way you re-enter cold water, 1 inch at a time, until your body adjusts. The wobble in my kitchen table is still there. I still haven't fixed it. I think maybe I've stopped meaning to. If this story moved something in you, hit like and subscribe.
You won't regret what comes next.